Chapter 5. Racial Tensions and Social Justice, A Nation Confronted. 5.1 Racial Injustice, From Slavery to Black Lives Matter. The history of racial injustice in the United States is both extensive and complex. It is a narrative that traces its lineage from the era of slavery through to the modern-day Black Lives Matter movement. The countless experiences of African Americans and other people of color with racism have indelibly shaped the fabric of American society. Slavery set the stage for this tumultuous history, a legal institution that reduced human beings to property, inflicting unimaginable hardships and setting a precedent for systemic inequality. This legacy of subjugation and discrimination did not end with slavery's abolition in 1865. It evolved and persisted, reinventing itself through practices such as segregation, Jim Crow laws, and mass incarceration. One cannot scrutinize the issue of racial injustice without acknowledging the institution of slavery. A foundational economic and social system, slavery in America began in the early 17th century and involved forcibly transporting millions of Africans to the New World for labor. The very inception of the country was shadowed by this extreme form of racial exploitation, which continued for over 250 years. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War, the supposed freedom was heavily attenuated for African descendants due to restricted rights and systemic barriers. The Reconstruction era that followed the Civil War promised a transformation of Southern society, with new rights and representation for freed slaves. However, this period was characterized by intense societal resistance to racial equality. Once federal troops were withdrawn in 1877, white Southern legislatures enacted a series of restrictive laws known as Black Codes to control and suppress the newly freed African Americans. Soon after, Jim Crow laws, a rigid system of racial segregation, took root and lasted into the late 20th century. During this period, African Americans were legally enforced to inhabit separate spaces, receive education in separate schools, and use separate public facilities from their white counterparts. Racial injustice was not only systemic but also brutal and violent. Lynchings were a common occurrence in the South, serving as gruesome public spectacles intended to reinforce white supremacy and instill fear within the African American community. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was formed in 1909 to fight against such acts of racial terrorism. It also sought to overturn Jim Crow laws and advocated for the civil rights of African Americans. Yet despite these and other grassroots efforts, change was slow and resistance was formidable. Civil rights activism intensified mid-20th century, epitomized by the Montgomery bus boycott, the 1963 March on Washington, and the activities led by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X. Their efforts, along with countless others, culminated in the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws were significant milestones, legally ending segregation and eliminating voting barriers. However, the nation's come to terms with racial equality was far from over. These victories did not dismantle the deeply ingrained racism within American society. In the subsequent decades, urban centers across the country faced numerous racial uprisings, often in response to instances of police brutality against African Americans. The Los Angeles riots in 1992, following the acquittal of police officers videotaped beating Rodney King, brought national attention to the persistent issue of race and law enforcement. Similar patterns have continued into the 21st century, with the criminal justice system being scrutinized for its disproportionate impact on people of color, specifically Black individuals. The rates of incarceration and the targeting of minorities through practices such as racial profiling have become central concerns for civil rights advocates. This leads to the evolution of new movements such as Black Lives Matter (BLM), initiated by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. BLM emerged in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer in 2013, and gained further momentum with the protests in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 following the fatal police shooting of Michael Brown. The movement calls attention to the systemic racism that remains present in America, and the ways in which this systemic inequity often manifests in violence against Black individuals. All of these events are modern iterations of the ongoing struggle for racial justice. Racial disparities also pervade other domains such as healthcare, education, and employment. Studies have shown that African Americans and Latinos often receive lower quality healthcare compared to their white counterparts, regardless of income or health status. In education, schools predominantly attended by students of color are frequently underfunded and overcrowded. The racial wealth gap further underscores these disparities, with median wealth for white families significantly surpassing that of Black and Latino families. This wealth gap is a direct outcome of discriminatory practices in housing, education, and labor over generations. The prompting of a national conversation about reparations has been one consequence of the growing awareness of historical and ongoing racial injustices. The conversation centers on the question of how to address the compounded economic and psychological harm done to African Americans through centuries of racism. While divisive, many argue that such measures are necessary to address the lingering effects of slavery and subsequent discriminatory policies. Yet, there is no consensus on what form reparations should take, with some advocating for financial compensation, and others pushing for more systemic changes in the form of policy reforms. Social media has played a significant role in shaping the discourse on racial justice, propelling the visibility of personal stories and cases of injustice. The dissemination of smartphone videos of police violence has sparked global awareness and mobilization, sometimes resulting in criminal charges against police officers. However, such transparency brings with it a set of challenges, including potential desensitization to Black pain and suffering, and the phenomenon of digital activism being both fleeting and susceptible to misinformation. The environmental justice movement highlights another facet of racial injustice. People of color are disproportionately affected by environmental hazards and lack access to clean air, water, and soil. The location of toxic waste facilities, lead contamination in residential areas, and vulnerability to the impacts of climate change are examples where race intersects with environmental issues. Activists from these communities call for not only environmental protections, but also the inclusion of racial perspectives in environmental policies and decision-making processes. As the United States continues to grapple with racial tensions, the need for constructive dialogue and action is paramount. Societal advances might have been made, but significant work remains to rectify the historical wrongs and to build a truly equitable society. Education, legal reforms, policy changes, and community efforts are crucial instruments to facilitate progress. At the heart of these efforts is the understanding that racial injustice is not merely a relic of the past, but a contemporary challenge that requires persistent effort and sincere reflection. It remains our collective responsibility to understand and address the roots and ramifications of racial injustice. This entails recognizing that past injustices have present consequences, and that progress is neither inevitable nor linear. Community engagement, advocacy, and policy reforms are necessary to create an inclusive society where justice is the foundation. This journey towards racial justice and social equity will be arduous, requiring solidarity and unwavering commitment. All the while, the narrative of racial injustice in America continues, as does the search for ways to heal and move forward. 5.2 Policing and Criminal Justice in Minority Communities. Policing and the criminal justice system have long been topics of significant concern within minority communities in the United States. These issues intersect with discussions on race, equality, and the state's responsibility to ensure the fair treatment of its citizens. It has been widely documented and discussed that people of color, particularly African Americans and Latinos, are disproportionately impacted by various aspects of the criminal justice system, from policing practices to incarcerative tendencies. This disparity suggests a systemic bias necessitating comprehensive review and reform. An examination of traffic stops and pedestrian stops indicates that African Americans and Latinos are more likely to be stopped by police than their white counterparts. Numerous studies reveal that these groups are stopped at higher rates, even when controlling for variables such as crime rates or neighborhood demographics. These disparities raise questions about the basis of such policing practices, whether they are motivated by explicit or implicit racial biases, and the broader implications for trust between law enforcement and minority communities. Once stopped, evidence suggests that African Americans and Latinos are searched more frequently than white individuals. These searches often lead to further criminal justice entanglements despite lower rates of contraband recovery compared to searches of white individuals. The psychological impact on those repeatedly subjected to such stops and searches is profound. It fosters a sense of being targeted, which erodes the trust in law enforcement meant to protect and serve all community members indiscriminately. The concept of over-policing in minority neighborhoods is another aspect closely examined by researchers. High police presence and aggressive enforcement tactics result in more citations, arrests, and interactions with the criminal justice system for residents in these areas. This heightened level of policing produces a greater likelihood of encountering law enforcement, which can lead to increased tension and a potential for conflict. It's crucial to analyze whether these practices are outcomes of requests for more policing due to higher crime rates, or if they stem from a biased view of certain communities as inherently more criminal. Parallel to the issues in policing are the challenges faced within the judicial system, including courts and corrections. Racial disparities continue through the bail system, where minority defendants are less likely to be released on their own recognizance and more likely to face higher bail amounts than their white counterparts for similar offenses. This variance makes pretrial release more difficult for those with limited financial resources, disproportionately impacting minority communities. Being detained before trial can have substantial negative consequences on employment, childcare, and other areas of personal life. Upon conviction, sentencing disparities underscore broader issues of inequality. Historically, policies such as the disparate sentencing guidelines for crack versus powder cocaine have disproportionately affected African American communities. Although some policies have been addressed and mitigated, sentencing remains an area fraught with disparity. African Americans and Latinos are often subject to longer sentences than white individuals convicted of similar crimes, which raises concerns about the equal application of justice. Re-entry into society post-incarceration is yet another challenge that disproportionately affects minority communities. Those with criminal records encounter barriers to employment, housing, and education, which hinders successful reintegration into society. The disproportionate number of minority individuals with criminal records exacerbates socioeconomic disparities and reinforces systemic cycles of poverty and criminality. Discussions about policing and criminal justice in minority communities cannot be divorced from the broader conversation about race relations in the United States. Historical and systemic factors, along with present-day policies, interweave to form a complex web of challenges. Elements like residential segregation, educational disparities, economic inequality, and societal biases all contribute to shaping the interactions between law enforcement, the justice system, and communities of color. Substantial research has also focused on the psychological impact these systemic issues have on individuals in affected communities. The constant exposure to law enforcement and the criminal justice system takes a toll on mental health, contributing to heightened levels of stress, anxiety, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. These negative emotional states can adversely affect community cohesion and the willingness to engage with public safety initiatives, further diminishing the efficacy of law enforcement efforts. In response to these pervasive issues, there has been a call for policing and justice reform from both within affected communities and from various sectors across the nation. Proposals range from the implementation of body cameras for police officers to increase accountability, to the abolition or defunding of police departments in favor of alternative community-based public safety models. The goal of these reforms is typically to establish a more equitable system that acknowledges and attempts to remedy existing disparities. Further solutions include improved police training that emphasizes de-escalation techniques, cultural competency, and the elimination of racial profiling practices. Advocates for reform also call for increased civil oversight of police departments, greater transparency in data collection and sharing, and the establishment of restorative justice practices that provide alternatives to incarceration. Efforts at reform must be comprehensive, addressing not only the immediate interactions between police and citizens, but also the overarching structural issues that perpetuate inequality. It's necessary to recognize the multidimensional nature of the challenges faced by minority communities when addressing policing and criminal justice. Law enforcement policies that may appear neutral on their surface can have unequal effects due to broader underlying social inequities. Thus, effective reforms must include cross-sector collaboration between law enforcement agencies, community leaders, policymakers, and social service providers. The role of education in reform cannot be underestimated. Educating both the public and law enforcement officers about systemic racism, its history, and its current manifestations can foster empathy and a commitment to change. Understanding the lived experiences of those in minority communities is a vital step towards bridging divides and developing meaningful solutions. This constant cycle of policing and judicial actions that disproportionately affect minorities creates an environment ripe for activism and change. Community organizers, civil rights activists, and concerned citizens are increasingly coordinating efforts to bring attention to these systemic issues and demanding change. This movement for social justice is a linchpin in the effort to transform policing and criminal justice into systems that uphold equity and justice for all citizens. To truly move forward, it will be crucial for all stakeholders to engage in a candid and informed dialogue about the deep-seated issues within the police and criminal justice systems. Such discussions must consider the complex interplay of race, socioeconomics, and the historical context that shapes contemporary realities. Policymakers, researchers, and community members must work collaboratively on evidence-based strategies that address the needs and concerns of minority communities while not compromising public safety for the broader society. The goal to create a more just and equitable society requires confronting these difficult truths about policing and criminal justice. It calls for a concerted effort to dismantle the discriminatory structures that hinder progress and to replace them with fair practices that reflect the true spirit of equality under the law. The path forward is not simple, but it is necessary for the health and harmony of the nation as a whole. 5.3 Economic inequality and racial disparities. Economic inequality in the United States has been steadily increasing over the past several decades, and this trend appears interwoven with racial disparities that stem from a complex history of systemic discrimination and entrenched social dynamics. While various factors contribute to economic disparity, such as globalization, technological advancements, and policy decisions, race remains a significant determinant of one's economic status. In stark terms, economic inequality manifests in differences in income, wealth accumulation, access to quality education, healthcare, employment opportunities, and justice. Income disparities are often the most visible aspect of economic inequality. Statistics reveal a consistent gap between the average incomes of white households and those of Black and Hispanic households. For instance, the median household income for Black families is significantly lower than that of white families. Several factors contribute to this discrepancy, including differing levels of educational attainment, historically segregated and under-resourced neighborhoods, and discrimination in hiring practices. Wealth, or the total assets owned by an individual minus their debts, is an even clearer representation of economic disparity. Due to historical injustices, such as redlining and employment discrimination, Black and Hispanic individuals are less likely to inherit wealth, own homes, or possess stocks and other investments compared to their white counterparts. This lack of accumulated wealth hinders the ability to cope with financial emergencies, invest in education for oneself or one's children, and compounds across generations. Educational attainment is both a cause and consequence of economic inequality. Higher education remains a key driver of upward mobility, yet access to quality education is distributed unequally across racial lines. Schools in predominantly white neighborhoods often receive more funding and resources compared to schools in Black and Hispanic communities. This discrepancy is partly due to funding mechanisms which rely heavily on local property taxes. As a result, racial minorities often receive an education that does not afford them the same opportunities to succeed economically as whites. The healthcare system is another area where economic inequality and race intersect, and disparities have profound effects on well-being and financial stability. People of color have lower rates of health insurance coverage and less access to healthcare services, leading to disparities in health outcomes. Poor health can perpetuate economic hardship by leading to higher healthcare costs, an inability to work, and reduced earning potential, creating a vicious cycle that is difficult to break. The employment sphere further highlights the intersection between economic inequality and race. Black and Hispanic individuals have higher unemployment rates than white individuals. When employed, they are often concentrated in lower-paying jobs, even after accounting for education levels. They also face barriers to promotion and are underrepresented in high-paying industries and leadership positions. Furthermore, discrimination in hiring practices continues to be a documented issue, despite laws intended to prevent it. Racial disparities within the criminal justice system also have cascading effects on economic inequality. People of color are more likely to be stopped, arrested, and convicted than whites. Having a criminal record can severely limit employment opportunities, contributing to higher rates of poverty and economic marginalization within these communities. Moreover, the financial burdens of the criminal justice system, such as bail, fines, and legal fees, often fall disproportionately on people of color. Housing discrimination and segregation continue to reinforce economic inequalities. The historical practice of redlining, where services were denied to residents of certain areas based on race, has left a lasting impact. People of color are more likely to live in neighborhoods with lower home values and poorer infrastructure. This not only affects wealth accumulation through home equity, but also limits access to quality schools, healthcare, and jobs, all of which are critical for economic mobility. The intergenerational transfer of wealth is an important aspect of long-term economic inequality. Due to historical disparities in wealth accumulation, white families are far more likely to receive inheritances and other intergenerational transfers than Black or Hispanic families. This head start in life can have far-reaching effects, providing capital for education, business investments, home purchases, and other opportunities that can increase wealth over a lifetime. Public policy plays a significant role in addressing or exacerbating economic inequalities. Policies such as tax laws, minimum wage legislation, social welfare programs, and education funding can either help bridge the economic gap or further widen it. For example, tax policies that disproportionately benefit the wealthy can exacerbate income inequality while doing little to assist the economically disadvantaged. Finally, the private sector has a part to play in mitigating economic inequality and racial disparities. Companies can enact equitable hiring practices, invest in diverse communities, foster inclusive work environments, and ensure fair compensation for all employees. Corporate social responsibility initiatives can focus on reducing economic disparities by supporting education, entrepreneurship, and community development programs aimed at leveling the playing field. The interplay between economic inequality and racial disparities presents one of the most challenging social issues facing the United States today. While progress has been made in certain areas, the persistence of this dual-sided inequality indicates that much work remains to be done in order to create a more equitable society. Addressing these issues requires a multifaceted approach, effective policy making, corporate accountability, and a shared commitment across all levels of society to dismantle the barriers that perpetuate economic disparities along racial lines. Addressing these deep-rooted inequalities is not only a moral imperative, but an essential step towards ensuring the strength and cohesion of the nation's social and economic fabric. 5.4 Racial Equity in Education. Racial equity in education is a fundamental yet complex component of the larger discourse on social justice in the United States. It pertains to the idea that educational opportunities and resources should be distributed and accessible to all students without biases based on race or ethnicity. Historically, systemic racism has significantly influenced educational policies and practices, resulting in disparities between racial groups. This impact is evident in various aspects of education, from early childhood learning to higher education institutions. The pursuit of racial equity in education is predicated on an understanding of the pervasive inequities that exist within the system. These inequities are manifest in numerous ways, including but not limited to unequal funding for schools predominantly attended by students of color, disproportionate discipline practices that affect students of color more severely, and a persistent achievement gap that indicates unequal educational outcomes. Despite improvements in some areas, substantial work remains to ensure equal educational opportunities for all. Disparities in school funding have been a significant issue for decades. A considerable amount of a school's funding comes from local property taxes. Therefore, areas with higher property values, and often a predominantly white population, have more resources to invest in their schools. Conversely, schools in areas with lower property values, which are often predominantly inhabited by people of color, receive less funding. This discrepancy leads to differences in the quality of physical infrastructure, the availability of advanced coursework, access to experienced teachers, and the provision of extracurricular activities. The implications of these funding inequities are far-reaching. Students from underfunded schools may encounter outdated textbooks, technology deficits, and a dearth of vital enrichment programs that can enhance their learning experience. The resultant environment does not facilitate the same level of educational achievement as seen in more affluent areas. The under-resourced schools face challenges in retaining effective educators and staff, often due to lower salaries and less supportive teaching conditions. Discipline disparities also play a critical role in the conversation about racial equity in education. Studies have consistently shown that students of color, particularly Black and Hispanic students, face harsher discipline than their white counterparts for similar offenses. Such practices not only contribute to a negative school climate for these students, but also to the school-to-prison pipeline, which can have lifelong consequences. By being disciplined more frequently and severely, these students are more likely to disengage from the educational process and face increased interaction with the judicial system. The academic achievement gap is another indicator of the entrenched racial inequities in the education system. Standardized test scores, graduation rates, and college enrollment statistics often reflect a divide between the educational attainments of white students and those of students of color. While there are multiple factors contributing to this disparity, the difference in educational quality and support across racially segregated schools is indisputably a dominant factor. Moreover, the curriculum and educational content often do not reflect the diverse histories and contributions of different racial groups. This lack of representation can impact the engagement and self-esteem of students of color, who may feel alienated by a curriculum that does not acknowledge their cultural heritage. Efforts to integrate multicultural perspectives and histories into educational materials are seen as critical steps towards racial equity in education. To address these complex issues, policymakers, educators, and advocates push for reforms that include equitable funding formulas, restorative justice disciplinary practices, culturally responsive teaching, and rigorous and inclusive academic standards that identify and nurture the potential in every student. Advocates argue that these reforms would not only create a fairer education system, but also build a stronger, more just society by leveling the playing field for all children. The pursuit of racial equity in education is closely linked to the larger goals of racial equity in society. As education is a key determinant of socioeconomic status, ensuring equitable educational opportunities is necessary for breaking the cycles of poverty and systemic racism. This is particularly important as the demographic landscape of the United States continues to evolve, highlighting the need to prepare all students to succeed in an increasingly diverse and global society. Attempts to improve racial equity in education often face challenges, including political opposition, budgetary constraints, and resistance to changing long-standing systems and practices. Effective change requires a concerted effort from all stakeholders, including government officials, community leaders, educators, parents, and students. It requires an acknowledgement of current disparities and a commitment to systemic change that prioritizes education equity for every student. The need for a diverse teaching workforce is also crucial in the movement toward racial equity in education. Research indicates that having teachers of color can have a positive effect on students of color, including higher academic performance, improved attendance, and a higher likelihood of students considering college. Unfortunately, the teaching profession does not currently reflect the diversity of the student body, and efforts to recruit and retain teachers of color have become integral to the broader strategy for education equity. Technology has emerged as an essential tool for enhancing equity in education. The rise of digital learning platforms, online resources, and educational software present opportunities to customize learning experiences to meet the needs of diverse learners. However, this technological advancement also brings about new dimensions of inequality, often referred to as the digital divide, wherein students of color and those from low-income backgrounds may have limited access to technology and the internet. Continued research and data collection are essential in understanding the conditions of racial inequity in education and measuring the impact of attempts to promote equity. Accountability systems and transparent reporting can support this aim by highlighting both progress and areas needing attention. This data-driven approach allows for targeted interventions and the efficient allocation of resources to address the gaps in educational equity. In working towards racial equity in education, it is essential to incorporate the perspectives and voices of those most affected by inequities. Engaging students, families, and communities of color in policy development and decision-making processes ensures that reforms are grounded in the lived experiences and needs of these communities. Collaborative partnerships between schools, families, and community organizations can also support the creation of an inclusive and equitable educational environment. The journey toward racial equity in education is challenging and continuous. It encompasses several dimensions, including resource allocation, disciplinary procedures, curriculum content, and the recruitment and retention of a diverse teaching force. Though the path is fraught with obstacles, the pursuit of a fair and just education system is both a moral imperative and a practical necessity for the nation's future. The success of such initiatives will define not just the landscape of American education, but the very fabric of society itself. 5.5 Race and Representation in Media and Culture. Among the myriad of contentious social issues impacting the United States today, few are as pervasive and deeply entrenched as racial tensions and their manifestations across various facets of society. One significant area where these tensions are both reflected and perpetuated is in the domain of media and culture. Media representation plays a pivotal role in shaping public perceptions by either reinforcing stereotypes or challenging misconceptions, and it is also where cultural narratives are constructed, deconstructed, and disseminated. The depiction of race in American media and culture influences how individuals see each other and themselves, and extends to television, film, advertising, news reporting, and the digital media landscape. When exploring the history of race representation in American media, it is evident that minorities have often been underrepresented and, when included, frequently subjected to stereotypical portrayals. The early days of film and television saw people of color cast in roles that were marginal, derogatory, or that emphasized exoticism and otherness. Characters such as the savage Native American, the lazy African American, or the inscrutable Asian were not just common tropes but the near totality of representation, reinforcing harmful preconceptions among audiences. The legacy of such portrayals has carried into the present in various forms, with minorities still often assigned roles that fit narrow and sometimes damaging narratives. Recent years have witnessed a slight shift with movements like #OscarsSoWhite and Black Lives Matter pushing for increased diversity and more nuanced representation in entertainment. This activism calls for film studios, television producers, and other content creators to showcase a broader spectrum of stories and to offer roles that capture the complexity of minority experiences. The demand for diversity extends beyond actors on screen to the writers, directors, and producers behind the scenes, advocating for inclusivity throughout the hierarchy of the entertainment industry. Representation in the creative process is crucial because it influences the authenticity of the stories being told and the characters being portrayed. The impact of representation in media and culture is significant because it can affect self-perception and self-esteem, especially among younger audiences. Studies have shown that when individuals do not see themselves reflected in mainstream media, or when they are consistently portrayed in a negative light, it can have deleterious effects on their sense of identity and worth. The perpetuation of stereotypes not only limits the potential of the individuals within these groups, but also restricts the worldview of the audience, leading to a cycle of ignorance and bias. Conversely, positive and diverse depictions can help to combat prejudice, broaden understanding, and foster a spirit of acceptance and inclusivity. The representation of race in news media also warrants examination, as it can have far-reaching consequences on societal attitudes and policy. Newsrooms and journalists carry the responsibility of providing objective and balanced reporting, yet the framing of events and the representation of racial groups within news stories can influence public perception. Issues of crime and poverty, for instance, are often disproportionately associated with racial minorities in news narratives, potentially reinforcing fears and biases in the population. Thus, a critical analysis of racial representation in news reporting is essential for understanding the potential perpetuation of inequity in the social consciousness. The advertising industry presents another complex aspect of race representation in media and culture. Advertisements not only reflect societal values, but also help shape them, and for a long time they have reinforced certain racial stereotypes or excluded minorities from narratives of success and desirability. However, there is an incremental push towards more inclusive and representative advertising as companies recognize the multicultural nature of their consumer base. Brands that exclude representation or rely on outdated stereotypes risk alienating segments of their audience and face a negative backlash that can resonate through social media and impact their reputation and sales. The proliferation of social media and digital platforms has introduced new dimensions to the conversation on race and representation. On one hand, these platforms empower individuals and communities to express their narratives and challenge mainstream media's choices of representation. On the other hand, they also provide spaces where negative stereotypes can be amplified and discriminatory behavior can manifest. The role that algorithms play in perpetuating echo chambers and biases is now recognized as a contributing factor to the divisions within society, highlighting a need for ethical reflection in the systems that curate and disseminate content. Changes in demographic trends in the United States have made the conversation about representation in media and culture more critical than ever. As the country becomes more diverse, the media must adapt to reflect the evolving tapestry of the American population. Shifting demographics represent both a challenge and an opportunity for media companies, a challenge to abandon outdated modes of representation, and an opportunity to embrace the richness that diversity brings to storytelling. The response to this demographic evolution can result in either greater division or more profound unity in American society, depending on whether media representation fosters misunderstanding or mutual recognition. Representation is not only about screen time or the number of characters from diverse backgrounds, it is about the depth of characters, the range of stories told, and who has the power to tell these stories. Merely increasing the number of minority actors in media is insufficient if these roles do not accord with real, varied experiences, and if the structural inequalities within the industry persist. For true progress to be made, the gatekeepers of media and culture must commit to fundamental changes that champion equity and diversity, not just in front of the camera or on the page, but in every aspect of production and decision-making processes. In addressing race and representation in media and culture, one must also consider the global influence of American media. Hollywood films, television series, and music do not just shape domestic attitudes, but also have a profound impact on how the world sees America and its people, and consequently, how various cultures are understood internationally. American media has the potential to either reinforce negative stereotypes on a global scale or promote a more nuanced understanding of race and race relations. A responsible approach to depiction of racial minorities in the global market requires a heightened awareness of cultural sovereignty and the diverse audiences engaging with American media content. The intersection of race and representation in American media and culture is inevitably a reflection of society's ongoing struggle with racial issues. These portrayals hold a mirror up to the nation and reveal where there is discord and where there is potential for positive change. Only through a thoughtful and inclusive approach across all media platforms can the true strength of the United States' diversity be celebrated and the promise of equality be advanced. It is through intentional and sustained efforts in representation that media can become a powerful force for social justice and for bridging divides that have long separated Americans from one another. 5.6 The arts as a mirror and challenger of racism. The arts have long been a compelling reflection of society's issues, serving not just as a form of expression, but as a powerful tool for social change. The pivotal role of the arts, encompassing literature, film, music, theater, and visual arts, has been particularly evident in addressing racial tensions and advocating for social justice in the United States. This section examines how various art forms have not only mirrored societal attitudes towards race, but have also actively challenged racism and inspired dialogue and action toward equity and understanding. In visual arts, artists have harnessed their platforms to address racial issues directly. Paintings, sculptures, photographs, and installations have portrayed the beauty and pain of the racial experience, often forcing viewers to confront uncomfortable realities. Artists such as Kara Walker and Kehinde Wiley have garnered widespread attention for works that turn a spotlight on the African American experience. Walker's silhouettes depict unsettling scenes of violence and power imbalances rooted in the history of slavery and racial segregation, asking audiences to reflect on the past's connection to contemporary injustices. Wiley's portraits, meanwhile, reimagine classic works with black subjects, juxtaposing traditional European art context with modern African American culture, thereby probing into themes of identity and representation. Literature has also served as a catalyst for racial understanding and reform. Through narratives and storytelling, authors of diverse racial backgrounds have provided readers with insights into experiences worlds apart from their own. The works of Toni Morrison, for example, not only provide profound commentary on the Black experience in America, but also challenge readers to dismantle their preconceived notions about race. Her novel Beloved, based on an African American woman who escaped slavery, opens a narrative space to discuss the trauma inflicted by slavery and its lasting impacts on descendants. Similarly, contemporary works like The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas bridge the gap between fiction and the Black Lives Matter movement, offering perspectives on systemic racism and police brutality against African Americans. In theater, plays and musicals have both showcased racial issues and served as instruments for societal reflection. August Wilson's Century Cycle chronicles the African American experience across several decades, addressing themes of racial injustice, cultural identity, and the struggle for equality in each play. On the other hand, blockbuster musicals like Hamilton have reimagined the nation's founding by casting actors of color in the roles of historically white figures, forcing audiences to re-evaluate the racial narratives commonly associated with American history. Music has been particularly influential in mirroring racial tensions and fostering social justice movements. The blend of music with social messages runs deep, with genres like blues, jazz, hip-hop, and rap rooted in the African American experience and shedding light on the community's struggles. Artists like Billie Holiday with her haunting rendition of Strange Fruit and Kendrick Lamar's All Right, which became a rallying cry for the Black Lives Matter movement, have used their lyrics to capture the essence of racial endurance and resistance. Through their compelling storytelling and call for change, these musicians have tapped into the hearts and minds of listeners, urging society toward a more just future. The film industry, too, plays a vital role in educating and influencing public perceptions of race. Movies and documentaries confront the audience with narratives of discrimination, resistance, and the quest for social justice. Films such as 12 Years a Slave and Selma spotlight key historical moments in the fight against racial inequality, while Get Out provides a modern take on racism through the lens of a psychological thriller, exploring the continuum of racial tensions in America. These films not only educate, but also invite audiences to grapple with the uncomfortable realities of America's racial history and its persistent implications. Even as the arts reflect societal issues, they also provide a medium for marginalized voices to be heard. By giving artists of color a platform, the arts sector can challenge the status quo and provoke conversations about racial inequities in society. This space is critical for advancing understanding among diverse populations and building empathy across different racial experiences. Murals and street art, for instance, have been utilized to memorialize victims of racial violence and catalyze community engagement around social justice issues. In many urban environments, these artworks occupy public spaces, transforming them into arenas of civic discourse and protest against systemic racism. Furthermore, the digital age has expanded the reach and impact of art on racial tensions. Social media platforms allow the rapid dissemination of artwork that deals with race, enabling it to spark discussions and movements on a global scale. Hashtags and viral artworks can mobilize communities, amplify minority voices, and facilitate collective action. Digital art and online exhibitions related to racial justice have emerged as accessible entry points for wider audiences to engage with and reflect on the issue of race. The intersection of arts and education is also a powerful meeting point for addressing racial issues. By integrating artistic works that contemplate race into school curricula, educators can provide students with a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of racial injustices. This approach stimulates critical thinking and fosters a compassionate understanding among young learners, who are often at the forefront of social change. The arts also serve to preserve the historical narrative of marginalized groups, ensuring that their stories form part of the collective memory. By honoring the achievements and acknowledging the suffering of minority communities through art, artists contribute to a more inclusive and accurate historical record. This form of cultural preservation is not only essential for understanding our shared past, but is also key to informing actions to create a more equitable future. Finally, it is also essential to recognize the institutional barriers within the arts themselves. While the arts can challenge external societal racism, they must also confront the internalized prejudices and exclusionary practices that exist within art institutions. Achieving diversity and equity within galleries, theaters, museums, and the music industry is crucial to ensuring that the arts continue to be a progressive force for racial justice. The influence of the arts on racial tensions and the pursuit of social justice is undeniable. Art has the power to transcend boundaries, connect diverse individuals, and ignite social change. It not only serves as a mirror reflecting societal issues, but also operates as a hammer, capable of reshaping the cultural landscape and challenging the ingrained narratives of racism. By engaging with the arts, society can confront difficult questions and move towards understanding, healing, and a more inclusive future. It is through this ongoing dialogue and creative expression that the arts will remain critical allies in the fight against racism and inequality. 5.7 Intersectionality in Racial and Social Justice. Intersectionality is a framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. It examines how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another, and how these intersections contribute to unique experiences of oppression and privilege for each individual. This lens of analysis emerged from the feminist thought of the late 20th century, and it is especially pertinent to the discussion on social justice and race relations. The term was coined by Kimberlé Crenshaw in 1989, and it has since become a crucial element in social equity work, highlighting that social injustices must be examined on multiple fronts. To start with, it is essential to understand that intersectionality challenges the traditional, one-dimensional approach to social justice, which might consider race, gender, or class in isolation. This earlier approach assumes that all members of a single group, e.g., women, African Americans, share similar experiences, views, or needs, which is not the reality. Intersectionality posits that people's experiences and struggles are shaped by multiple, intersecting identities. For example, the experience of a black woman in America cannot simply be understood as equal to the sum of the discrimination faced by women and the discrimination faced by black people. It must also consider the specific intersection of those identities and how they combine to affect her life. The concept of intersectionality is particularly important in the United States, where racial tensions are often at the forefront of social justice debates. In examining racial tensions, an intersectional framework insists on considering how blackness is experienced differently based on other overlapping identities. A black transgender woman may face transphobia, in addition to the systemic racial discrimination and sexism faced by non-transgender black women. Understanding these nuances is essential for creating effective social justice strategies that can address complex forms of inequality. Intersectionality acknowledges that racism can and does interplay with other forms of discrimination and oppression. Applying an intersectional lens can reveal how systems of power and discrimination, like patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, and homophobia, work together to create barriers that can further marginalize those living with multiple identity markers of oppression. For instance, intersectionality can explain why economic policies that negatively impact the lower class can disproportionately harm minority communities who may already be dealing with racial discrimination and other obstacles in society. This understanding compels policymakers and social justice advocates to consider overlap and avoid solutions that may inadvertently benefit one group while harming another. The conversation around intersectionality also stresses that there is no universal experience of race or any other identity. The privileges and penalties attached to race, gender, class, sexuality, and other identity categories are not the same for everyone, and their impacts can differ drastically depending on the context and environment. Consequently, policies that do not take intersectionality into account can perpetuate inequalities by not addressing the specific needs of all marginalized people. Activism and advocacy are also deeply affected by intersectional thought. For example, movements like Black Lives Matter have drawn attention to the specific ways in which black men and women experience police brutality. This movement has explicit intersections with issues of gender and sexuality, and has highlighted the necessity of addressing the unique violence faced by black transgender people, whose stories are often excluded from mainstream narratives about police brutality and racialized violence. Similarly, intersectional theory is critical for understanding the educational achievement gap in schools across the U.S. The intersection of race, socioeconomic status, and local governance often determines resource allocation and quality of education, which can have lifelong impacts on students. Without an intersectional approach, educational reforms may fail to address the complex factors that underpin this gap. Intersectionality also offers a valuable perspective when dealing with healthcare disparities that are particularly prominent within American society. These disparities cannot merely be attributed to racial or economic factors alone. For example, research shows that Black women are more likely to die from breast cancer than white women, a statistic that requires an analysis that takes into account race, gender, socioeconomic status, and access to healthcare. An intersectional approach would necessitate healthcare policies that address this confluence of identity and experience. 5.8 Community Empowerment and Resistance. Community empowerment and resistance play pivotal roles in shaping the landscape of racial tensions and social justice initiatives in the United States. Efforts to enhance community cohesion and assertiveness are often responses to social injustices that disproportionately impact marginalized groups. Historically, the empowerment of communities of color and their resistance to systemic oppression have led to significant societal changes. The civil rights movement exemplified the power of collective action and community organization. These historical lessons continue to inform strategies in confronting current issues of racial inequality. Initiatives aimed at community empowerment typically focus on building the capacity of individuals and groups to effect change in their communities. These are multifaceted endeavors that can include the development of educational programs, economic investment initiatives, and the establishment of community centers that provide a host of social services. Empowering a community often involves enhancing its members' skills and knowledge, thereby increasing their efficacy in advocating for themselves and their neighborhoods. This form of empowerment facilitates a more active participation in democratic processes and can help to balance the scales of societal power dynamics. Economic empowerment is a vital aspect of community development. Marginalized communities frequently experience economic disenfranchisement, which reinforces cycles of poverty and limits opportunities for advancement. Various community-led initiatives aim to promote economic growth and sustainability. These may include the formation of worker cooperatives, support for minority-owned businesses, and facilitation of access to credit and financial services. By building a stronger economic base within a community, residents can exert greater influence over their social and political environments. Educational initiatives play an essential role in community empowerment. Quality education provides individuals with the tools needed to navigate and change the systems within which they live. Community organizations often develop local educational programs designed to meet the specific needs of the population they serve. These programs might focus on literacy, vocational training, or college preparation. Additionally, efforts to reform public education systems to better serve all students, regardless of race or economic background, are a focal point of many social justice campaigns. Community centers and local organizations are the bedrock of community empowerment. They provide safe spaces for individuals to gather, share resources, and organize. These centers often offer a variety of services, from health and nutrition programs to legal aid and counseling. They also serve as hubs for organizing protests, voter registration drives, and community-based research projects. As locales of empowerment, these centers cultivate leadership within the community and enhance its members' ability to collectively respond to social and economic challenges. Cultural empowerment is another significant aspect of community resilience. Communities celebrate and preserve their cultural identities through festivals, art programs, and the establishment of cultural institutions such as museums and libraries. These cultural practices nurture a sense of identity and pride among community members. Recognizing and valorizing one's heritage can reinforce community solidarity, particularly in the face of external pressures that may aim to erode cultural distinctiveness. Grassroots activism is often synonymous with community resistance. When formal channels of change are inaccessible or ineffective, communities may resort to organized protests and demonstrations to voice their discontent and demand for change. Activism at the local level can draw national attention to localized issues, thereby generating broader public support. Successful grassroots movements can sometimes prompt legislative and policy changes that benefit not just the local community, but larger populations as well. Technology and social media have transformed the nature of community empowerment and resistance. Digital tools enable rapid organization and communication, which allows for the mobilization of community actions with unprecedented speed and scale. Online platforms can amplify marginalized voices, disseminate critical information, and forge connections between disparate groups facing similar struggles. Social media campaigns can raise awareness and funds, and they can contribute to the narrative framing of social justice issues. Intersectionality is a crucial consideration in community empowerment endeavors. Communities are composed of individuals with diverse identities and experiences. Effective empowerment strategies must be inclusive and acknowledge the myriad ways in which race, class, gender, sexuality, and other aspects of identity intersect. Programs that are sensitive to these intersections are more likely to address the needs of the entire community rather than a privileged subset. Resistance efforts that embrace intersectionality can build stronger, more united fronts against injustice. Legislative advocacy is an important facet of community empowerment. While grassroots activities are effective at raising awareness, concrete changes often require the passage of new laws or the reform of existing ones. Community leaders and activists, therefore, engage with politicians and policymakers to translate public sentiments into legal action. Lobbying, testifying in legislative hearings, and contributing to the drafting of bills are ways in which empowered communities can influence the legal landscape. Despite many strides made toward racial equity and social justice through community empowerment and resistance, challenges remain. Systemic barriers such as voter suppression, police brutality, and unequal access to healthcare persist. Communities seeking to empower themselves and resist these ongoing issues must constantly adapt their strategies and build alliances both within and beyond their localities. By learning from historical movements, leveraging current technologies, and embracing the diverse identities of their members, communities continue to strive for a society in which justice and equality are not just ideals, but lived realities. The commitment to community empowerment and resistance against social injustices underscores the persistence and resilience of marginalized groups across America. The journey toward racial equity and inclusive social structures is an ongoing process, but the collective efforts of dedicated individuals and communities demonstrate the remarkable potential for societal transformation. Through building solidarity, sharing knowledge, advocating for fair policies, and celebrating cultural riches, communities are creating a more equitable future, one action at a time. Their engagement in the social, political, and economic arenas signifies the evolving narrative of a nation, confronted with and actively addressing the challenge of racial tensions and the quest for social justice. 5.9 Racism Beyond Borders, a global issue. Racial tensions are not unique to the United States. Racism is a pervasive global issue, crossing borders and cultural lines throughout the world. While the nuances of racism can vary by region and culture, the fundamental injustices and problematic ideologies share common roots in xenophobia, colonialism, and histories of oppression. In the global context, racism can be observed in policies, social systems, and day-to-day interactions across different nations and continents. In Europe, for instance, there have been significant instances of racial bias against refugees and immigrants, particularly those coming from the Middle East and Africa. This tension rises from a complex mix of social and economic factors, often fueled by nationalistic sentiments and fears over job security or cultural homogeneity. In several European countries, political parties with anti-immigrant agendas have gained support, demonstrating how racial prejudices can become entrenched in political systems and amplify societal divisions. Looking farther east, caste-based discrimination in South Asian countries is a form of racism deeply rooted in the region's history and social hierarchy. Despite legal frameworks to outlaw caste-based discrimination, such as the Indian Constitution's provisions, the social practices continue to marginalize individuals born into lower castes, affecting their social mobility, economic opportunities, and personal dignity. This is a form of racism that is tied intricately to local customs and religious beliefs, showcasing the cultural specificity of racism. In countries like Brazil and other parts of South America, racism intersects with class and economic status, where individuals of African descent or indigenous peoples face disproportionate poverty and violence. While these societies are often portrayed as racial democracies due to their mixed heritage, the reality is that racial disparities in education, healthcare, and employment opportunities persist, revealing deep-seated prejudice and discrimination. In the Middle East, racism can manifest in attitudes toward migrant workers, often originating from South Asia and Southeast Asian countries. Despite these workers being essential to the economic infrastructure, many endure substandard living conditions, lower wages, and discrimination in their daily lives. This form of racial inequality is sometimes overshadowed by geopolitical issues, but is nonetheless a stark reminder of global racial hierarchies. Africa itself is not immune to racial tensions, often seen in the form of tribalism or xenophobia between different ethnic groups within and across national borders. In many cases, these rivalries have historical underpinnings that were exacerbated by colonial practices of divide and rule. Post-independence, these tensions sometimes escalate into violence and conflict, illustrating that racism can be more intricate than a black and white dichotomy. The legacy of colonialism in many parts of Asia and Africa has left a lasting impact on racial dynamics today. In places where the concept of race was embedded through colonization, hierarchies based on skin color persist to this day. The preference for lighter skin is prevalent in many societies, perpetuating self-racism and the stigmatization of darker skin. This form of discrimination often intersects with global industries like marketing and entertainment, promulgating these ideals globally. However, the current global landscape also provides tools and platforms for confronting and challenging racism. International organizations, such as the United Nations, have initiatives and declarations aimed at promoting racial equality and cultural understanding, including the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, ICERD. Such frameworks offer a basis for countries to build their anti-racist policies and engage in constructive dialogue. Moreover, the digital age has allowed for unprecedented connectivity among activists, thinkers, and everyday individuals, fostering transnational movements against racism. Social media campaigns and online discourse can unify people from diverse geographic regions in their fight against racial prejudice and discrimination. Movements like Black Lives Matter have resonated worldwide, sparking discussions on local and global platforms about the manifestations of racism. In the educational sphere, there is an increasing emphasis on multicultural curriculums that address the histories and experiences of various racial and ethnic groups. Understanding how racial discrimination has unfolded across the world plays a crucial role in creating a more informed and empathetic global citizenry. Education becomes a pivotal force in dismantling stereotypes and promoting cultural sensitivity. Despite the global efforts, it's important to recognize that progress is uneven and that there are still many places where racism is deeply entrenched with little to no signs of waning. The rise of nationalist sentiments in various parts of the world often correlates with anti-immigrant policies and racism. These developments are reminders of the ongoing challenges faced by advocates for racial justice and the need for sustained commitment to addressing the complexities surrounding racism on a global scale. Racism beyond borders is an intricate web of historical, social, and political threads. Tackling it requires a multidimensional approach that can adapt to the local contexts of each society, while drawing on the collective experiences and solidarity of global movements. The goal is not merely to lessen overt acts of racism, but to disassemble the systemic structures that perpetuate inequality and bias. It's through understanding the global nature of racism that societies can begin to combat its effects and eventually envision a world where racial justice prevails. 5.10 Paths towards racial healing and reconciliation. In recent years, discussions about racial tensions and the imperative for social justice have come to the forefront of America's consciousness. This has prompted a myriad of initiatives aimed at fostering racial healing and reconciliation. Despite the spectrum of differing opinions and the complexity of these issues, there exists an emerging consensus on the necessity of addressing the nation's troubled history with race and seeking common ground towards mutual understanding and respect. The journey to racial healing is multifaceted and long-term. It requires sustained dialogue, comprehensive policy reform, community-based actions, educational initiatives, and individual commitment to change. The first step in the journey towards racial healing is acknowledging the deep-rooted history of racism in the United States. Education plays a crucial role in this regard, as an accurate and comprehensive understanding of history is imperative to grasp the extent and impact of racism. Years of disparity and systemic barriers have led to ingrained prejudices and inequalities. Educational reforms should aim at expanding curricula to include a more diverse range of perspectives and ensuring that the historical context of racial issues is more thoroughly explored. This does not only apply to primary and secondary schools, but also to higher education where deeper research and discussion can occur. Reforming the criminal justice system is also paramount. The current system disproportionately affects people of color and contributes to ongoing distrust and discord. One approach is to review sentencing laws that unfairly target minority populations, including re-evaluating penalties for nonviolent crimes. Another is to enhance police training programs that focus on de-escalation, diversity, and implicit bias. Increasing the accountability of law enforcement officers and agencies when incidents of misconduct occur is equally important. These changes are intended to create a more equitable legal system and promote trust between law enforcement agencies and the communities they serve. Economic disparities along racial lines pose a significant barrier to reconciliation. Addressing this issue involves promoting equitable access to opportunities. Initiatives like investing in minority-owned businesses, ensuring fair hiring practices, and enforcing anti-discrimination laws in the workplace can foster economic justice. Improving access to quality education and healthcare, reforming housing policies to prevent segregation and inequality, and advocating for living wages are other important steps. Such measures would contribute to reducing the economic disparities that fuel social stratification and resentment. Local community initiatives also hold the potential for promoting racial healing. These initiatives often involve collaborations between local government, nonprofit organizations, and community leaders. They can take the form of town hall meetings, cultural exchanges, and neighborhood projects that bring residents together to foster dialogue and collaboration. Communities can create safe spaces for individuals of different racial backgrounds to share their experiences and perspectives. Through these personal interactions, stereotypes and prejudices are challenged, ultimately allowing for greater understanding and unity. In addition to organizational and community-led initiatives, individual action is equally critical. Each person can contribute to racial healing by becoming more informed, challenging their biases, and engaging in conversations about race. It is important for individuals to listen to and validate the experiences of those who have faced racial discrimination. Acknowledging that racism is not just a problem of the past, but a present reality is key. Individuals should also advocate for the fair treatment of all people in their personal and professional spheres, and be willing to stand up against racism wherever they encounter it. Another essential component of the path towards racial reconciliation is the concept of restorative justice. Restorative justice seeks to repair the harm caused by crime or injustice by focusing on the needs of the victims, the offenders, and the community as a whole. This can include community service, dialogue between victims and offenders, and efforts to reintegrate offenders back into society as productive members. The application of restorative justice principles can help society move forward by addressing grievances, fostering forgiveness, and promoting lasting peace between racial groups. The influence of media and technology in shaping perceptions cannot be underestimated in efforts to promote racial harmony. Traditional and social media have an immense impact on how racial issues are portrayed and understood by the public. It is necessary to advocate for fair and balanced coverage of events that involve race. Media outlets must be urged to resist sensationalism and to give voice to a diverse range of perspectives in their reporting. Furthermore, social media platforms should actively work against the spread of hate speech and misinformation, which only serve to exacerbate divisions. Art and culture provide another avenue for racial healing. Artistic expressions such as literature, music, theater, and visual arts can offer powerful narratives that foster empathy and solidarity across different racial backgrounds. Art can propel important conversations and facilitate a shared understanding by humanizing diverse experiences. Programs that fund and celebrate multicultural art projects serve to elevate minority voices and build bridges of understanding. Encouraging collaborative art initiatives that involve participants from various racial backgrounds can be an innovative approach to healing and reconciliation. The powerful role of religious and spiritual communities in the United States offers yet another dimension to efforts aimed at racial healing. These communities often serve as moral compasses for society and have historically been at the forefront of social justice movements. Churches, temples, mosques, and other religious institutions can lead by example, preaching inclusivity and love, organizing interfaith dialogues, and offering programs that bring together believers from different races and ethnicities. By actively working toward reconciliation within these influential spheres, religious institutions can lay a profound groundwork for wider social change. Finally, long-term commitment to the effort of racial healing is vital. It is not an endeavor to be undertaken and accomplished within a brief span of time. The very fabric of society must evolve to be inclusive and just in its treatment of all races. This implies that every strategy and action taken must be sustainable and equipped to address persistent inequalities. Policymakers, community leaders, and everyday citizens must continuously evaluate and adapt their approaches to ensure progress. Future generations depend on the actions of today, making it imperative that the work done now is not only effective but endurable. The journey towards racial reconciliation and healing in the United States is a daunting yet necessary task. It demands a combination of broad-based and targeted strategies, engagement across various sectors of society, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. While there is no single solution to eliminate racial tensions, a multifaceted approach that encompasses education, criminal justice reform, economic justice, local initiatives, individual responsibility, restorative justice, media integrity, artistic collaboration, religious leadership, and long-term commitment may pave the way for a more united and just nation. Through persistent and cooperative efforts, America can look forward to a future where the promise of equality and undivided community prevails.